Hello class, today we want to talk about the doctrine of creation or God's originating work. Why do we need to study this? Well, several reasons. One, the Bible emphasizes the doctrine of creation in Genesis 1 and in John 1 and other places. Secondly, it is an important part of the church's faith. Going all the way back to the 2nd century, problems with Gnosticism sought to minimize the importance of creation or degrade creation as something inherently evil. The Bible teaches that God's creative work was good, so it is important to the Christian faith. It affects how we understand other doctrines. It shows the difference between Christianity and other world religions. It is also a point of dialogue, sometimes contested, between Christianity and science. And there have been sharp disputes about the doctrine in modern times. So, what are the elements of the biblical teaching on creation? What are the essential elements? What are things that we need to know? Well, first of all, the Bible affirms that God created all things out of nothing. God created all things out of nothing. This is most clearly stated in Hebrews 11:3, but there are numerous other passages as well. Secondly, creation is all-inclusive. John 1:3 tells us that God made all things. Thirdly, the triune God is involved in creation. Erickson says, while creation is from the Father, it is through the Son and by the Holy Spirit. So all three persons of the Trinity are involved in creation. And then creation's goal is God's glory. We see this in Psalm 19:1. So the goal of creation is God's glory. Now, what is the theological meaning and significance of creation? Well, first of all, everything derives its existence from God. Everything then is dependent upon God. God's original creative act is unique. Nothing that God created is intrinsically evil in itself. We are responsible for our own evil actions, so we cannot blame our conduct on nature, heredity, or any of these other factors. We are responsible for our choices. We are responsible for our own evil actions. Creation helps us put in right perspective the importance of the incarnation. Jesus became a full human being to redeem us and to redeem creation. It helps us to avoid unnecessary asceticism that seeks to punish the flesh simply because it is flesh. It reminds us that there is an interconnectedness in creation. All things come back to God created, and this has racial dimensions. This has racial dimensions. We need to remember that all of the races really are one race. They are the human race. And we have different ethnic groups and different cultures and different languages and different skin colors and these things, but we are all humans created in the image of God. It excludes dualism, the idea that there is a good God and an evil God locked in perpetual battle with one another, and it excludes emanationism, that all of creation somehow just emanated out from God, apart from God's control or desire. God and creation are separate and distinct entities. It demonstrates the limitations of being created. There are only so many things we can do as created beings. Now, what about creation and science? This is a hot area of discussion today. And a lot of good work is being done by people in the intelligent design group and other areas in this regard. But what do we want to think about creation and science? Well, what about science in the Bible? Let's start there. There is a desire to see the Bible and science related to each other. How do they connect? What are the points of contact? There's the reality of open warfare. Oftentimes, the scientific community is positively hostile to any kind of biblical worldview. For some, this results in the abandonment of faith. They embrace scientific knowledge exclusively and say there's no place for God, miracles, or any of that, and they abandon the faith. Others abandon science and embrace a kind of fideistic faith, a kind of blind faith. So here's a question. Is the Bible a technical book of scientific knowledge? No, it is not. The Bible's focus is on human salvation. If God had inspired Moses to write a detailed account of every aspect of creation, the ancient Hebrews would not have preserved it because it would have had no meaning for them. So, our scientific world and scientific knowledge exist within a particular historical context that would not have made sense to the ancients. So the Bible is not a technical book of scientific knowledge. Its focus is on human salvation. However, biblical affirmations do have scientific implications. And so we don't want to just discard the Bible and say, well, science deals with this over here, and religion deals with this over here. We're back to Kant and the bifurcation of the phenomenological and the pneumatological. We don't want to do that either. But we do need to recognize that this is an area of contested scholarship. What about the age and the development of the earth? A strict biblical dating places the creation of the earth somewhere around 6,000 years ago. If you go by a strict biblical dating, following the genealogies in Genesis, you arrive at something around 6,000 years ago. Geologists today, however, date the earth in terms of billions of years. How do we reconcile that? Well, this is part of the ongoing conversation and debate. Erickson, in his book, advocates a progressive creationism, where creation happens in stages over a longer period of time. What about the question of evolution? Well, evolution involves two distinct categories of discussion and thought. There is macroevolution and microevolution. Macroevolution, you'll learn more about this in science classes, and I'm by no means a science teacher, but macroevolution involves the idea, the theory that one species or family evolves into something distinctly different. Microevolution deals with the now known reality that within species there are variations that take place, and within families of plants and animals there are variations that take place based on a number of factors. And so macroevolution is a theory. Microevolution is pretty well established. And progressive creationism typically works within the realm of microevolution. So we got to know what the boundaries are. What are the boundaries? Science cannot give an overall explanation of the universe. It does not address the question of why. Why are we here? That is a spiritual and philosophical question. Why are we here? A good resource, a good place to look for more information on issues related to science and evolution would be the intelligent design people and Stephen C. Meyer and some of these people. They've done some extensive, very extensive and detailed scientific research in this area, and I highly recommend their work. So what are the implications for the doctrine of creation? Everything God has made has value, first of all. If God made it, it has value. And if it exists, God made it. God's creative work includes not only the initial creation, but also his ongoing directing of creation, the idea of providence. And we're going to talk about that in the next lecture. Scientific investigation is justified. God gave us minds to use and curiosity with which to explore creation. And so scientific investigation is justified. But we are reminded that only God is self-sufficient and eternal. Only God is self-sufficient and eternal. Now, I want to talk to you for just a moment about a way to look at Genesis chapter 1. And this is not original with me. This is from a book published in the 1980s by two secular scholars of ancient Near Eastern studies, Isaac Kikuwata and I can't think, Quinn was the last name of the other guy. The book title is Before Abraham Was. Before Abraham Was. And Christian scholars have picked up on this. You'll see this in Matthew's commentary on Genesis. You'll see it in Garrett's little book on Genesis. And J.I. Packer talks about this. Other scholars, Christian scholars, have picked up on this. In the ancient context of the time in which Moses lived, stories like this were told in such a way as to help people remember them, because they were passed orally, oftentimes from generation to generation. What we have here is a literary analysis of Genesis 1:1 through 2:3. And so I want to show this to you, and this will be in the notes in the course module. But we have a prologue, which is verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was void and without form, and darkness was covering the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And so that's Genesis 1 and 2. And that is a prologue that tells us that God created everything, and there was this initial stage of creation. And then God begins to take this initial stage of creation and work with it and shape it and mold it into the world we know. And so we have 7 days total. We have 6 days that are days of activity, and then we have the day of rest. So what do we have here? We have days 1 through 3 are days where environments are made, the creation of environments. Day 1, God creates light and darkness. God creates light and darkness, verses 3 through 5. Day 2, God creates the sky and the oceans. This is verses 6 through 8. On day 3, the dry land appears, plants grow, and bodies of water are separated as the land comes up. So you have lakes, streams, rivers, oceans, that sort of thing on day 3. Okay? Days 4 through 6 correspond to days 1 through 3. This is the creation of occupants, of living things. So on day 4, we have sun, moon, and stars. That corresponds to day 1, light and darkness. So I hope you're following me here. There's a correspondence across here. That's verses 14 through 19. Day 5, we have aquatic life and birds. That corresponds to sky and oceans on day 2. Day 6, we have land animals and man, and that corresponds to the dry land and the plants. And then day 7 is our epilogue, where God rested, chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Not only that, I want you to see something else in the process here. I want you to see a progression from non-living to living. This is vitally important as we understand the biblical doctrine of the sanctity of life. We go from non-living to living things in a steady progression. We have environment, we have occupants. Days 3 and 4 are transition days. So I want to bracket those. Days 3 and 4 are transition days. Because with the appearance of dry land, we have plants. Plants are, in the ancient Near Eastern mindset, they're sort of alive, but they're not quite, because they reproduce. Plants reproduce, so they're sort of alive, but not quite. On day 4, the sun, moon, and stars are sort of alive in that they move. They exert motion, but they don't reproduce. So they're not really alive. But there's a transition going on here from non-living to living. What makes something fully alive is the ability to both move and reproduce. In the ancient Near Eastern mindset, motion and reproduction make it alive. And we get to that on day 5 with aquatic life and birds. We have things that both move and reproduce. And the pinnacle of that, of course, is on day 6 with the creation of man. And so there's a progression from non-living to living that emphasizes the sanctity of life down to the creation of man, who was made in the image and likeness of God. And so you see how this all works together here. This tells us a vision of the idea of creation that works theologically without creating conflict with the scientific realm, because we have the proper ordering of environment and occupant. And so this is another way of looking at Genesis 1:1 through 2:3 that you may find helpful as you wrestle with questions of science and faith. Okay, that's our discussion of creation. We'll pick up with the doctrine of providence next time.